Shane was right about everything, and Rick Grimes spent 8 seasons proving him right. That one stings a little bit if you grew up rooting for Rick, but stay with me. Shane saw the apocalypse for what it was on day 1. No grief period, no adjustment phase, and no clinging to a sheriff's department protocol in a world where now no one gives a shit about authority. We literally got zombies chasing people. He looked at the collapse and understood it the way a surgeon understands a patient on the table, clinically and quickly without the luxury of being wrong. Rick spent the better part of 2 seasons treating Shane like the problem, when Shane was really just the answer Rick refused to see. The reason The Walking Dead grabbed millions of people and refused to let go had nothing to do with zombies. Walkers were always the backdrop, yeah, but the real show was watching a group of ordinary people discover one brutal situation at a time, and exactly how far they could bend before they either broke or became something they didn't recognize. AMC built an entire ecosystem around that question: spin-offs, sequels, prequels, because the question never gets old. What do you give up to keep people alive? And once you give it up, can you ever get it back? Shane answers no, and he was the first to say it. The Sophia storyline is where the show draws its first real line in the sand. The whole group fans out across the Georgia countryside for a little girl who, as Shane quietly understood pretty early on, probably wasn't coming back. That search wasn't hope. It was the group refusing to update their math. Shane watched it drag on, and he really couldn't say it out loud without becoming the villain. When Herschel's barn opened up and Sophia walked out already turned, it validated every uncomfortable thing Shane had been saying for weeks. The show didn't let him gloat. It just let him be right. Then there was Otis. That moment where Shane shot Otis in the leg and leapt into the walkers to save himself and the medical supplies needed to save Carl is the single most polarizing decision in the show's early run. People called it murder, and technically, yeah, but Shane came back with the supplies. Carl lived, and Shane had to look Otis's wife in the face every morning after that and invent a story about her husband dying heroic. He carried that. He didn't hand it to a committee or write it in a journal. He absorbed it alone because someone had to make the call and everyone else was too busy being decent to do it. The apocalypse's moral math is ugly. What people miss about Shane is that he didn't really crash out. That's the thing the show wants you to assume because it makes Rick easier to root for. But Shane wasn't a man who cracked under pressure. He was a man who processed the truth faster than anyone else and then got punished socially for doing so. Lori turned on him. Dale turned on him. Even the audience turned on him at one point, and he still kept the camp alive while Rick was in a coma, kept Carl fed, and kept Andrea from completely unraveling after Amy died. Nobody wanted to say thank you for any of that because the gratitude would have required admitting he was right, so they made him the problem instead. If you're new here and you want more deep dives into franchises that actually make you think, hit subscribe. Rick's prison arc is him trying to become Herschel. Farming, schedules, family dinners, and a council to make decisions so no one person had to carry too much weight. He literally put down his gun and picked up a shovel. And for a minute, it actually worked, which is the show's cruelest trick because it lets Rick believe that the version of himself he liked was still accessible. Then the governor showed up and the whole thing collapsed into blood and fire. And Herschel, the moral sinner the whole group orbited around, lost his head literally on his knees in a field. After that, Rick's quote-unquote peace went straight out the window. It became something like a weird mask he just put on for Carl. Lori's death in the prison was the psychic break that made everything after it feel different. Rick's grief didn't make him soft. It made him quieter in a way that was scarier than loudness. The man who came out of that moment wasn't trying to honor Shane's worldview. You could tell it changed him for the worse, and the only thing that kept him stable was Carl and baby Judith. The Claimers changed the texture of the show into this dark, dog-eat-dog kind of vibe. Joe and his group operated on one rule: if you claim it, it's yours. And if you break that rule, the group basically beats you to death. When Joe's group caught up to Rick on the road and put a knife to Carl, Rick didn't negotiate, stall, or appeal to anyone's humanity. He literally bit out Joe's throat with his teeth. Then he gutted the man, threatening Carl without blinking. And honestly, the way that weirdo was looking at Carl, I would have did the same thing too, I can't lie. But the sheriff from season 1, the guy who cried in a tank talking to a zombie, was completely gone. What was left was something that Shane would have recognized immediately. Terminus should have been the last time anyone in that group trusted a sign on the road. The cannibals who ran it weren't anything insane like the governor or Negan. They were just normal people, and that's what made these couple of episodes gnarly as hell. They were survivors who'd been victimized so badly that they flipped entirely and decided literally to just start eating people, and that was the cleaner option. Rick saw through the setup before they even walked in. He buried weapons outside of the fence because he had Shane's voice in his head. The one that said trust is a liability had become his own internal monologue by that point. When they got out and Rick wanted to go back and finish it, it wasn't just revenge. What they did in that church was some of the most cutthroat shit we saw from the group up to that point. Garrett's death is one of the cleanest examples of Rick crossing from reactive violence into something premeditated. He made a promise, and he kept it. He used a red-handled machete, specifically because he told Gareth he would, and he wanted the man to know in his final seconds that Rick Grimes is nothing you want to play with. That's not the behavior of a hero. That's the behavior of someone who has fully absorbed the apocalypse's first lesson, which is that hesitation is a donation to whoever's willing to move faster. There's a version of Rick Grimes that never meets Shane, never gets shot, never wakes up in that hospital, and probably dies in the first wave alongside every other cop who assumed the situation was containable. The fact that Rick survived long enough to become what he became, I really don't think that was luck on his part. I think it's because Shane was always in Rick's head. Every time Rick tries to turn away from his own brutality, he's really turning away from Shane's reflection, looking back at him, knowing that deep down, Shane was right. The show understands this. It keeps putting Rick in situations where the only exit is through a door Shane already told him would be there, and Rick keeps acting surprised when it opens. Alexandria is where the show shows us a glimpse of hope, just to drive the group to one of the most savage levels we've seen up to this point, because it forces Rick into a room full of people who still think the old world's rules are worth preserving. Deanna Monroe ran the place like a HOA with better intentions, and the Alexandrians had managed to survive mostly by avoiding that kind of content that would have tested them. Rick walked in and immediately read the place the way Shane used to read the camp at the quarry. Comfort as denial, routine as avoidance. Pete Anderson was abusing Jesse, and nobody was doing anything about it because the community's stability felt more important than just confronting one dude. Rick put Pete in the ground and in front of everyone because the system just wasn't going to. The thing Alexandria represented wasn't safety. It was the false mentality and tie to what the world used to be. The people inside those walls had managed to avoid the kind of loss that restructures a person, and that insulation made them read Rick as unstable when he was actually just like calibrated to a reality they'd been lucky enough to skip. At this point, everyone in the group lost someone they loved. That gap between the group's experience and Alexandria's is exactly why Rick kept getting labeled dangerous by people who'd never had to make a dangerous decision. Spencer Monroe is one of the cleanest examples I can think of for this. A man who grew up inside the walls, resented the people keeping him safe, and then tried to go behind Rick's back to Negan with the expectation that smarter politics would actually save him. And as a result, Negan gutted him all over the street. The apocalypse doesn't negotiate with people who pretend it isn't happening. Morgan showing back up in Alexandria is the show holding a mirror up to everything Rick had become. Morgan rebuilt himself around the psychology of nonviolence after losing his son, and he really believed that every life had value, including the lives of people actually trying to kill the group. Rick looked at Morgan and saw the man he used to want to be, and he couldn't afford to go back to that. Their conflict at the time didn't feel like good versus evil. It felt like two different answers to the same trauma, and the show is pretty honest enough to make both of them partially correct. Carl was a perfect character that embodied knowing nothing but carnage. He grew up in a world where violence was just part of the grind and what was needed to survive. He watched Rick kill Shane, saw Rick spiral when Laura died, fought the governor, survived Terminus, battled Negan, and came out on the other side as a completely different man. Every lesson Rick learned, Carl pretty much learned it too. The difference was that Rick remembered the old world. Carl barely did. That's why Carl's darkest moments never felt completely out of character. He was raised by survivors who were constantly forced to choose between being good and staying alive. But Carl never lost sight of something Rick, Shane, and even Negan struggled to hold on to. He could still imagine a future beyond the next fight. While everyone else was focused on surviving tomorrow, Carl was thinking about what came after. That's what made him different. Not because he was tougher than everyone else, but because he never stopped believing there had to be something more than just survival. The satellite outpost attack at the start of the Savior War is one of the franchise's best examples of aggressive certainty generating consequences that nobody planned for. Rick's group wiped out a Savior compound based on incomplete intelligence, believing they were cutting the head off the snake. They weren't even close. Negan showed up with half the eastern seaboard behind him, and Glenn and Abraham paid the price for a calculation Rick just flat out got wrong. Negan's line that Rick started the war is incomplete as a moral argument, but it's accurate as a description of cause and effect, and that accuracy is what makes it hit so hard. The Savior arc spread the cost across the whole group. Maggie's grief hardens into something organized and purposeful. Daryl's loyalty sharpens into a willingness to sacrifice himself for the better of the group in ways that never felt forced. What the show is doing in this stretch is showing that a leader doesn't just shape outcomes, they shape the emotional architecture of everyone around them. Rick's decisions didn't just affect Rick, they restructured how the people who loved him understood the world. Carl's death is the moment the show finally forces Rick to start treating the future like a battlefield. Carl's final letter told his father that survival can't be the endpoint, and that a world with no plan beyond staying alive is just a slower version of dying. Sparing Negan, choosing to let him live as proof that the old world's ideas of justice could still mean something. It was the first decision Rick made that Shane's logic just couldn't explain. Shane would have put Negan down and moved on. Rick stopped the blade and tried to build something instead. That choice is Rick finally consciously rejecting the ghost he'd been carrying since the farm, not by going soft and not by pretending violence doesn't work, but deciding that a world shaped entirely by Shane's ideals isn't a world worth surviving into. Then the CRM takes everything Shane ever believed and turned it into policy. Then the CRM takes everything Shane ever believed and turns it into policy. The Civic Republic military doesn't agonize over moral math. They solved the equation decades ago and bureaucratized the answer. Their A-B classification system treats human beings as variables, useful ones and less useful ones. And their willingness to destroy entire communities isn't cruelty. It's all about logistics. Shane said one life for another. The CRM says thousands for a civilization, and they've got the infrastructure to back it up. What makes them terrifying, and what World Beyond and the ones who live laid out slowly, is that their logic is airtight from inside their own framework. They wholeheartedly believe they are the best chance humanity has. They might even be right, but that's the part that keeps you coming back to the show. Rick understands the CRM because he speaks their language. He built a version of that logic himself, block by block, from Shane's barn to Terminus to Alexandria to the Savior War. He knows what it costs to make the brutal call and then live in the same body that made it. What he refuses to accept is a system that removes the person from the cost. That industrializes the decision so nobody has to sit with what it means. That's the line he wouldn't cross, and it's the only meaningful line left after everything else got erased. The zombie lore was always telling the same story underneath everything. Jenner's revelation at the CDC that everyone's already infected and that death itself is the trigger reframed the entire apocalypse from a disease story into a human nature story. The walkers aren't the disease or the primary focus of the show, just background danger. The walkers are just what happens when the disease runs its course. The real outbreak was always the one happening between the survivors. Shane understood that from episode 2. Rick spent years trying to prove himself wrong, failed, succeeded anyway, lost almost everything in the process, and ended up somewhere neither of them could have predicted at the quarry, trying to build a future his dead son described in a letter, inside a world that never stopped trying to make that impossible. At the end of the day, Shane was right about what the apocalypse demanded. He was just wrong about what it should cost to answer.